Serial sexual abuse of boys as young as 13, routine bullying, harassment and intimidation, more than 1,000 cases, and a culture of impunity that allowed it to continue for decades. These are some of the horrific findings of a report into decades of systemic abuse within the Australian Defence Force. The report was completed and handed to the Defence Minister months ago. In March, he released only redacted extracts from the executive summary. Now, using freedom of information, 730 has obtained the full executive summary, and its contents will shock you. Political editor Chris Ullman has this exclusive report.
The Defence Force has earned a reputation as one of the most respected institutions in Australia. But for decades, it's battled a mostly secret internal war against persistent claims of sexual and physical abuse. Those deep wounds were opened very publicly last year.
It was like my whole world just came crashing down around me.
An 18-year-old officer cadet at the Australian Defence Force Academy, known only as Kate, said a colleague had filmed them having sex and broadcast it on Skype to a group of cadets watching in a room nearby.
There was stills taken on phones, and those were then shown and distributed to various other people.
Kate's story unleashed a deluge of complaint.
Emails, phone calls, faxes.
The Defence Minister's office was inundated with allegations of abuse, so he launched an investigation.
We need to very carefully, exhaustively and methodically deal with all of those complaints.
And hundreds of stories spanning 60 years poured into the review held by law firm DLA Piper, from acts of ritual bastardisation to horrifying tales of brutal sexual assault.
He took me back to his room, made me take off my clothes and then penetrated me.
John was one of the 847 people who lodged a complaint.
In 1988, I was in the Air Force and based in Victoria. I was raped by a 50-year-old corporal. He also raped and sexually abused other minors in the Air Force at the time. There was an investigation. I was the whistleblower regarding the incidents, many incidents. It then came to the knowledge of the commanding officers, which I already knew about, and he was discharged, and consequently, I was 18 at the time. They also wanted me discharged as well.
John's story is eerily similar to others told to the investigators, but when the review was released in March this year, it was heavily censored. Only 10 pages of the executive summary were made public.
In October last year, I received from DLA Piper Volume 1 of their report. And today I'm releasing extracts from that in a redacted version, following on from advice of the legal team at DLA Piper and the Secretary of the Department of Defence.
730 now has the entire 25-page summary of the report. It makes shocking reading. The edited version had a single line which noted the earliest reported abuse was in 1951 on a 13-year-old boy. But the full story is much more disturbing. Abuse of children was not isolated in defence, in place or time. It was widespread.
It is certain that many boys were subjected to serious sexual and physical assault and other serious abuse while they were in the ADF from the 1950s through to the 1970s and possibly into the 1980s.
The Navy recruited 13-year-olds until the late 60s or early 70s, and until the 1980s, all three services recruited boys as young as 15. In that time, the report says,
the ADF and successive Australian governments failed to put in place adequate protections to take into account the special needs and vulnerability of boys of 13, 14, 15 and 16 years of age to protect them from other boys and from adults in the ADF.
A number of inquiries with young boys, young apprentices, 13, 14, 15, over a long period of time.
Victims were often drawn into the abuse.
Many of the boys who suffered such abuse later participated in inflicting similar abuse on other children in the ADF.
The review also received complaints from men and women who'd been recruited as young adults, 17 to 20 years of age, finding
it is certain that many young males and females have been subjected to serious sexual and physical assault and other serious abuse while they were in the ADF from the 1950s at least into the 21st century.
The review finds defence and governments failed to protect the young adults, and again that some of the men went on to become abusers. It cites the former junior recruit training base in Fremantle, HMAS Lewin, as one of the worst incubators of abuse in the late 1960s and early 70s. And of a chapter in the review that's still secret, it says,
the examples selected are horrific because they give an indication of the sort of abuse that occurred.
What happened at HMAS Lewin is no secret to Barry Heffernan of the Vietnam Veterans Association.
I mean, HMAS Lewin was a common denominator there, and they had the various levels of peer pressure, and you started off at the bottom, and you wore it, and then we found that there are blokes who well, they were victims, so they decided to victimise somebody else. You know, I guess it's the law of the jungle, isn't it? You know, it's like that. And to young kids who are naive off the streets, 15 years old, and what do? They fear for their lives. I mean, you know, what a hell of a way to live a life and begin life like that.
Many of the boys, young men and women who were abused went on to suffer lifelong torment.
Past 25 years, basically I've been in institutions, in and out of hospitals, psychiatric wards. Hard to trust people, relationships, never been married. Really haven't had a job in 25 years.
Lawyer Brian Briggs acts for many of the victims. He isn't surprised by the review's findings.
It acknowledges that there's been a failure in the duty of care. There's definitely, over a long period of time, historical abuse cases, 4 or 5 inquiries in the past. Sure, there's been a breach of the duty of care that was owed to these young members and service personnel.
The report finds that abuse persisted in defence despite multiple reports and attempts to end it. So it tries to identify the risks in military culture that give rise to it.
No adverse consequences for abusive behaviour, a culture discouraging reporting of abuse, and the chain of command structure in defence lends itself to superiors abusing juniors with impunity.
I know one girl who was raped, and she told her CO about it, and he just said, well, that's basically the way it goes, Dales. And she's worn that ever since and turned to alcohol and all the rest of it.
There appears to have been no appetite in defence to prosecute abusers.
Defence records show very little evidence that perpetrators had been called to account.
And perhaps most disturbing of all,
there is a risk that those perpetrators now hold middle and senior management positions within the ADF, and there is a risk that those who witnessed abuse and did not report what they witnessed now hold middle and senior management positions within the ADF.
But Brian Briggs believes there is little likelihood that anyone will be held to account.
I don't think that they could go back, although a lot of the inquiries and the complainants that I saw could name names, and there were people that went on to become senior officers that were the perpetrators. Whether they're held to accountable, it'd have to involve either criminal proceedings, and you're talking, years and years and years that have gone by. So I don't think that prosecutions would be too interested in taking people to task.
There was some hope that this review would make a difference, but it's fading.
It's not in the hope of getting a bag full of money. It's just somebody to take notice of us and maybe, ask us, if there's anything they can do to help us. But that doesn't seem the case right now.
John hasn't even been told if his submission has been deemed credible.
Well, I think if it is a plausible claim, as they say, 775 people, they should be notified instead of basically sitting back and worrying and stressing more, because it's bringing up the past, not just for myself but for a lot of other people, and just get everything out in the open. Don't keep hiding things.
And it's important to remember that while there's a long and unsettling history of abuse in defence, some of the claims of physical and sexual assault are current.
Continuing, even today, on my desk I've got an inquiry, a member in the Army, currently serving, subjected to abuse, bullying, harassment. It's going on. I've got inquiries as recent as today, going back days, weeks. It's still going on.
And John fears there's little hope of real change in defence.
I'd only believe it if it actually happened to the minister himself, if he had a son or a daughter and they were in the Defence Forces. Then something might change.
That report from Chris Yillman was produced by Nikki Tugwell.